Welcome back to another episode of the Daily Flip podcast. I'm your host, Alex, and today we're going to be flipping through some of the top stories pertaining to issues that are kind of going underneath the radar in this election, but are still ones that will get people out there to vote. The single issue voters who really care specifically about two topics that we'll be going into, and a final article talking about how being a little bit skeptical as you go in to vote is not necessarily a bad thing. Though I don't necessarily agree, it's an interesting article nonetheless. And of course, we will end today with our Daily Delight, a story meant to leave you feeling positive, ready to take on the day. But that's enough rambling from me. Let's jump into our daily debate. So, if you're voting on one issue, and one issue only, what is it? Throw it down in the comment section. I want to know. A lot of people, they want to vote on pro-life, pro-choice. A lot of people want to vote on pro-gun, anti-gun. A lot of people want to vote on climate change nowadays, especially in the younger generation. So throw down what you believe in the comment section, and maybe I'll issue a little response to either one. Maybe I'll give it a little like. With that said, let's jump into our first article that comes from National Review. The headline reads, Second Amendment voters aren't buying Harris's pandering, but they're glad she feels compelled to try. So, obviously, Miss Kamala Harris has been not roasted, but at least questioned on the Second Amendment issue a lot, especially after her appearance in the debate when she talked about how she has a gun. She is a gun owner just like Tim Walz is. And people always look back to her time running in 2020 where she would be not opposed to doing some sort of gun buyback or at least heavy restrictions on the use of guns. They also look at her time in California. And that's what this article opens with. It obviously talks about, it gives a little bit of background about what she's saying now. But then they go into actually what she did when she was a district attorney in the city of San Francisco. So we'll just jump straight to that quote to outline her history on it, because we don't want to pretend, we're talking about what she did when she was vice president, what she said on the campaign trail. While she could do things as vice president, she doesn't necessarily have all the powers to set the agenda. So let's go to a time when she did have the power to, quote unquote, set the agenda and pursue what she wanted to pursue. Quote, Harris's attack on the Second Amendment date back as far as 2006, when she served as San Francisco district attorney and supported a total handgun ban in the city. A ban so radical that even then Mayor Gavin Newsom didn't support it. The measure, Proposition H, would have prohibited city residents from buying, selling, or owning handguns of any kind, and banned, quote, all city residents without exception from selling, distributing, transferring, manufacturing firearms and ammunition, end quote. So you may be saying, well, that sounds like it is in absolute violation of the Second Amendment. What do you mean? They're restricting your ability to even buy one. Now, it doesn't technically say that you can't own one, but you're definitely putting in a whole bunch of restrictions so that it is almost impossible to actually have one. And you're saying, for the people that are a little bit sympathetic to it, it's like, well, it's kind of skirting the line there. Fair enough. I would say that this is tantamount to just having not tantamount, because, I was going to say it's tantamount to having a gun buyback. Not necessarily, because you're not forcing people to give the ones that they already own. But it is tantamount to, in a generation, not having any guns from, most of the citizens. I would say most of the citizens not having any guns, because they're not allowed to sell them. They're not allowed to buy them. They're not allowed to transfer them. So what? They have to go out of the city in order to do it. They have to go to another state. A lot of people aren't going to necessarily do that in order to get a gun. The really passionate people are, but the rest are not. So that's one of those little tricky ones. But the reason that she gets away with this thing that seems almost preposterous is because she actually later on kind of tilted her hand when she filed an amicus brief going into the DC versus Heller case. And the amicus brief argued something like this, quote, Harris argued in her brief that, and this is a direct quote, the Second Amendment applies only to federal legislation, not legislation of the states or local governments, end quote, and that, this is the beginning of the second part of a different quote, the Second Amendment provides only a militia-related right to bear arms, end quote. So you can see where she's coming from. You can see her interpretation of the law here. It is not something that the state governments have to stick by. If they want to create their own local legislation that does not necessarily protect people's rights to bear arms, that's not their issue, because at the end of the day, that is a federal provision in the Constitution, is what she's arguing. And the second part that she argues is it's only in terms of a well-regulated militia, essentially. So, that's a argument that we've heard for quite some time. Is the comma in the Second Amendment actually meant to make them separate clauses, or is it meant to make them a joint clause? There's plenty of people who have examined this over and over again, but you can at least see where she's coming from, which is definitely not the unlimited to a perspective. She is obviously closed off. And that doesn't necessarily have to be the end of the world for every other person out there, but for the single issue voters, for the people who are going to the ballot box to defend their gun rights. In this specific instance, they're sitting there saying, actually, no, I don't actually feel very good about what she is doing here. I mean, there are multiple quotes in here from people who say, I don't know, I feel like she's kind of pandering to me. Quote, she was shocked to hear Kamala says she owns a Glock. This is from a woman called Lisa Ludwig. Quote, but she says she'd still never vote for the vice president, who she views as disingenuous. Quote, I feel like it's almost a ploy to be like, oh, don't discount us because we're one of you, which is fair enough, because when you just randomly pull this fact out that, oh yeah, hey, I'm a gun owner, when you've said many things in the past about not necessarily being pro 2A and not going out and advocating for everybody's right to have the guns, and even doing things when you had the ability to set your own schedule. You're not just voting on things as a senator when she was a senator. You're not just rubber stamping things as a vice president. But when you actually are able to set your own schedule, and your own schedule led to you putting heavy restrictions on gun ownership in the city, and obviously it was struck down in the courts, but she attempted to do so with Proposition H, yet people are going to believe that you're disingenuous. Now, there's also one more layer to this. What about during the campaign? What was she saying then? So let's jump back to some of the moments that she was actually on the campaign trail in 2019, and she was saying, and this is during a primary, so she's obviously appealing to the Democratic side. She has to get the base behind her before she can move on to the general. So remember that. Obviously, political winds are going to shift, and maybe she's going to sound a little bit more radical for the base, but we still have to take them at face value for the most part. So just because she's pandering to the base doesn't mean that we can't say, well, hey, you said this, even if it was during a primary. Quote, Harris espoused a similar disdain for the Second Amendment during her first unsuccessful bid for president in 2019. At the time, she rejected the idea that she would need Congress's approval before imposing a ban on assault weapons. She also supported the mandatory confiscation of 20 million plus that are already in circulation, of the 20 million plus that are already in circulation, end quote. Also, that little editorializing on their part, during her first unsuccessful bid for president in 2019, you could just say during her primary run in 2019 and not have to do that little dig at her when it's unsuccessful. But you know what? National Review, they can do what they want to do, obviously. They are allowed to editorialize however they want. I just thought that was interesting when I was going through it. But the point being that, yeah, no, that's not good. That's not good. Then again, remember, this is not direct quotes from Kamala Harris. So these are implications from what she was saying, except for the part where she said a ban on quote-unquote assault weapons. So these are implied from the actions and the words that she said. That doesn't mean they are direct quotes like some of the previous ones, which were written down, or legal documents like the amicus brief or Proposition H, where you can clearly see what the intention is. It is obviously spelt out. This one is a little bit more wishy-washy. Now, does that mean that she didn't say any of those things? No, but you have to draw a pretty straight line there. You have to have the end goal in mind when listening to some of these statements. So if you go into the statement saying, hey, I want common sense gun reform, and you hear that, and you're like, okay, so that probably means like getting rid of certain guns, making it harder to get a gun in certain areas, maybe mental health checks, more background checks, so on and so forth, closing quote-unquote gun show loopholes, which seem to be more rare than it was previously talked about in like 2016, 2018, but fair enough. But if you go into this hearing that she wants to take away your guns, then you hear common sense gun reform like, oh, she's really coming down hard on all these guns. She's going to make sure that I can't even have a conversion kit. She's going to lock things out. And if you come in hearing that or if you come in thinking that you want a candidate who is going to really restrict guns, you hear common sense gun reform, it can be taken so many different ways. In that case, it would be taken, okay, yeah, she's going to really crack down on this to make sure that we're protecting our kids in schools and our families and things like that, and make sure that illegal guns aren't out there, and even some high-capacity legal guns aren't out there. So it's such a blank term that she was talking about during that time. And also, she did say that she'd be okay with a buyback. There's a quote of her doing it in an interview, but at least with the common sense gun reform line from her campaign, that can be taken so many different ways. So remember, when you're coming to this with priors, which National Review and the gun owners are, because they're trying to defend their gun rights, they can draw that straight line there. It doesn't necessarily look that straight and that narrow to everybody else. But, that's just me discussing a little bit, trying to be a little bit more fair to Harris and her 2019 time when she was a quote-unquote different person. Do I believe that? No, she's not really that much of a different person. She's just running for a different office, or she's in a different stage of the election than she was then, which means she has to run to the middle. But let's actually discuss how this single issue has been effective in the past and possibly changing the elections. Quote, there are many people who, quote, bullet vote. They vote on the gun issue first and foremost, and if you're bad on the gun issue, they will never cast a vote for you ever, he said, adding that Harris's comments show that Democrats understand that this is a third rail. He points to at least one example where a push to restrict guns proved politically poisonous to Democrats in 1994. The party lost control of the U.S. House in part for pushing for an assault weapons ban. So, this is the potency of single issues. This is why I wanted to talk about this, because obviously I wanted to display the record, and we'll do the exact same thing in the next segment when we talk about the next issue, which is climate. But for right now, we're on guns, and we're going to talk a little bit more broadly about the one-issue voter kind of thing. So there are not many one-issue voters, and each group is not necessarily a large subsection of the voting population. So, and if that was the case, and if there was a large enough chunk that basically everybody in that chunk was a one-issue voter, and you could get maybe a third of the electorate, I'm pretty sure every single politician would be pro this, pro that. So they're pretty rare, but that doesn't mean that they don't exist. It doesn't mean that they don't play some sort of role, especially when you go into different states. So if you go into Louisiana with an idea to restrict guns outright, you're probably going to have a harder time than if you do it in Kentucky. If you try to do it in Montana, you're going to have a very different response than if you're trying to do it in Oregon. So obviously, in certain states, these single issues are much more important. And what happens to be the breakdown in some of these key states, such as your Pennsylvanias, your Michigans, your Wisconsins, you're probably getting a little bit of pro-2A sentiment, but not necessarily a whole bunch of it. Now, Georgia, a little bit different. That's the key one. In Arizona, it's a little bit mixed there. I wouldn't say that it's a leading issue. And to pretend as though that this one issue will flip the election in any given state or any given battleground state is naive. But it's to say that when we have single issue voters like this, they are so passionate that you have to align perfectly with them, basically. You don't necessarily have to be a purist, but you have to be basically right on the same point as them, because otherwise they're not going to vote. So that doesn't mean you can just go through and discard them, because it's going to be really hard to capture them, because they do want that purist, or at least that person that's on the same wavelength as them. But it does mean that you need to weight it very differently when you're having these sort of discussions. Do I think Kamala Harris's issues with guns are going to actually come back and bite her in the butt? Honestly, no. I don't think that this group is strong enough to affect that much change. The average American wants you to be able to own a gun. The average American probably says there could be some restrictions because they see emotional arguments in how guns are used negatively, and they get struck in the heart by that because they're not unfeeling people. They're normal. They are able to empathize with the families that lose people. They can see the statistics. So it's a bit of a middle-of-the-road position. Neither party is necessarily coming to them and saying, hey, this is where we need to be on this, and this is why I think that where you are is perfect. No, most Americans are saying, okay, you either have the pro 2A to the absolute extent or the anti 2A. And whether either one of those arguments or those positions appears wrong or is wrong in your opinion of either side, it doesn't matter because that is the perception of them. That's how it's been for so long. And I don't think Kamala Harris is going to break through on this issue this time. And I also don't think even if she did, it would really have a big effect on the election. So that doesn't mean that we need to ignore it, but you can see why this has not been the largest talking point throughout the course of the election. But that doesn't mean we don't need to focus on it, because noticing exactly what the National Review points out here is that generally people do like guns, or at least are okay with them for self-defense, and any sort of restriction or slash full-out ban most people would not accept. And Kamala Harris has to at least pander to that idea. She has to play to the middle, and that's why it's important. That is why it is extremely, extremely crucial to pay attention to these sort of things. And if you're trying to get a better understanding of politics in America, understanding the single issue voters and why they're not voting for people give you an insight as to what the quote-unquote purist position would likely be, and therefore give you insight into how purists and others who might vote on this issue and normal people actually feel about said issue. All right, so with that said, that was a little bit of a long rant there at the end. Let's jump into our next article that talks about climate change. It's from Common Dreams. Climate groups warn the third-party vote could hand over planet's future over to Trump. Now, for those of you who are sitting back and saying, "Oh, okay, this is a single issue as well," I don't know. I think it falls into, let's be clear, it is a single issue, and there are single issue voters. That would be childish of me to say that it's not either one of those things. What I mean to say is that, is this going to be a single issue that actually can define the race? I don't know. I have a hard time believing that people vote only on climate change. I know there are activists out there that do, but I don't know what their proportion is. I would say the amount of people that vote only on climate change is lower than the amount of people that vote only on guns. But I would say in the broader populace, people that factor in climate change into their decision making is about the same as people that factor in guns. And then again, guns are I don't want to say they are a necessary part, but they are most definitely a fundamental part of the American perception of itself. A lot of Americans see, even if they don't necessarily own a gun, they see guns as part of the American ethic, whether it be using them to expand west, whether it be to defend ourselves and fight against the tyranny of the British government, whether it be to protect against any sort of encroachment by the government that we may experience, whether it be Shays Rebellion. There's so many different instances where guns were used to defend their rights or to even aggress against the government or what people were claiming were tyrannical actors within said government, that I think that is really embedded in the ethos of America, and that's why I think a lot of people care about it. But also, this next generation is deeply concerned about climate change, and I think you have enough people who are also factoring in climate change into who they are voting for. But does that mean that they should flip to the Green Party? Are there enough of them out there that they should flip to a person like Jill Stein, who is probably the best? If you're a climate change absolutist, Stein is probably the best person on climate change. And this article outlines, well, hey, if you're going to go for Jill Stein, if you're going to be a single issue voter on climate, maybe you should consider what happens if she's a spoiler again and if Donald Trump was to win. Quote, while the letter thanks Stein, the Green Party candidate in West, who is running as an independent, for, quote, raising important issues to this election, the groups argue that Harris, quote, is the only candidate with a record of success addressing climate change, pointing to her tie-breaking vote in support of the Inflation Reduction Act and legal action against oil companies during her tenure as California's Attorney General. Now, as we have gone into her record before, and we've broken things down from the gun perspective, this is a relatively compelling argument. Like I said last time, it's not necessarily what you do when you're on the campaign trail, or what you say when you're on the campaign trail, or when you're a vice president. You can't necessarily set your own path. But during her time as a Attorney General of California, and then also as a district attorney in San Francisco, if these are places where she has all the power, so to speak. Obviously, there are other political machinations that go on behind the scenes, but so to speak, she has all the power and she's able to actually set the agenda. That's when you should care about these sort of things the most, rather than having to just vote on something and not necessarily bring forth legislation or be in the vice presidential chair and just kind of rubber stamp whatever Mr. Biden is doing. So they're trying to make a compelling argument for her. But what is the argument against Stein? Because if you're going to say, hey, we have a pro-Kamala argument, but you know that in principle that Jill Stein is better on the climate, you have to also make an argument against Miss Stein. And I was going to say you have to make one against West as well, but no, you don't. No offense, Cornell. You ain't winning this one, and probably a lot of people are going to peel on to Miss Stein because she is really, really close there. But let's go into the anti-Stein message, so to speak. Quote, Stein and West are among several third-party candidates on the ballot in critical states that could decide the presidential contest. Recent polling has shown that Stein and West are both polling around 1% in the key state of Michigan, where Harris and Trump are in a dead heat. Michigan has received a significant amount of attention this election cycle, given that it is the birthplace of the uncommitted national movement, which began as a primary campaign effort to push President Joe Biden to halt U.S. support for Israel's assault on the Gaza Strip. End quote. And you may be saying, Alex, how is that an argument against Jill Stein? It is an argument implying that Jill Stein has enough of a pull to shift the election by 1%. And Cornel West, though I did just mock him a second ago, he has enough pull to, and I didn't mock him as a person, just the fact that he's going to actually be president. I was joking about that. No offense to you, Mr. Cornel West. You seem like a man who is passionate about every single thing that he talks about, and making sure that his message gets out there, even, cycling through 3 different political parties throughout the course of a primary. But whatever. But it does show that both of them have enough pull. If you combine them 2% by themselves, each 1%, then that can change an electoral college decision. That can change. I mean, it won't necessarily change the popular vote necessarily, but it will change the electoral college outcomes ever so slightly. And if those are in the right districts, then you could see something where it's not going to come down favorably for Kamala Harris. And Jill Stein does not have the ability, no offense, Miss Jill Stein, she does not have the ability to actually win the presidency. It is almost statistically impossible at this current moment. And with that being said, that is why she is the non-good climate change candidate. She may be the most purist, but when it comes down to practical means, she is not going to be able to actually implement any of those changes. And the argument from the article is, if she helps, even accidentally, even by just going out there and campaigning and pulling votes away from Harris, because guess what? If you're going for your top 3 climate candidates, if you're a single issue climate voter, Trump is not on the top 3. It's West, it's Kamala, and then it's Stein. Or it may even be Stein, then West, then Kamala. That would be from first to third order, and the first one would be from third to first order. But even then, you're not necessarily taking away from Donald Trump, which means that you're taking away from Kamala. And if Donald Trump gets in, the article goes on and says he will not do a good thing for the environment. He will not do any good things for the environment. And I want to get to a very specific quote they have in here. Quote, one analysis estimates that a second Trump presidency could result in additional 4 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions by 2030, negating recent progress in renewable energy development and inflicting large-scale climate change. Fossil fuel industry attorneys and lobbyists are already drawing up executive orders for Trump to sign should he prevail on November 5th. So they're making a clear argument. If the environment is your number one issue, Kamala is the only person that can both win and has a track record on actually implementing change. And I love that they put that in there because, honestly, if they were to be 100% honest, the main reason that this article is coming out and that they would vie for Kamala Harris is because she actually has a chance of winning, and she's a little bit pro-climate. That would be the honest answer. But they sprinkled in the part where she's actually had the ability to, in elected office, to implement some change even on a national scale as a senator with the Inflation Reduction Act, which is fair enough. You're sprinkling it on top and you're trying to add an extra justification, but don't lie to your people or don't bury the lead and say, well, she also is the only one that can win. Maybe just come out directly and say that and be honest. Now, some people would say that's a little bit of selloutism. That's not believing that the system can change. I think that the system can indeed change. I don't think the Green Party is the one to do it. I don't even think the Libertarian Party is the one to do it this cycle. I think that there's a future for both of them and that they're building towards it. But to pretend as though they can actually win this election cycle is totally different. Then again, if you're voting on principle and just the key issues, hey, fair enough. Make sure that you go out there and vote and give those support to those people and let them slowly gain extra traction throughout the rest of the country. Fair enough. But remember, if you're a single issue voter on climate, Common Dreams is making a pretty, I would say, compelling argument for Kamala Harris to be the person that is on the top of the ballot the person that you fill in at the top of the ballot. Do I personally agree? Am I a climate single issue voter? Nope and nope. But you got to at least hear these sort of arguments out. And like I said, when we're talking about single issue, you have to have a deep understanding of what actually drives these groups. Because if you're just a political observer, you have to understand what all the factors are going in so you can have a comprehensive view. And if you're a political actor, yeah, you should probably know where you need to appeal, why you need to appeal them, and what appeals have worked in the past. All right, so with that said, let's jump into our final article that comes from Mises.org. The headline reads, "It's good to be skeptical of elections." And I agree and disagree with this. Do you need to be skeptical of practically anything where handing over power to people or winning power is involved? 100%. Do you have to always just be skeptical of elections specifically and some of the ways that they frame these sort of things? I don't know. I understand what they're getting at, but I also feel as though they're kind of bearing the lead with that headline. But you know what? Hey, it is what it is. So let's go into literally the first paragraph, and then if you're intrigued from here, I'll do a little discussion, but you can go read this article yourself because we are running low on time, unfortunately. Quote, "We are less than 2 weeks away from Election Day. Polls show that the race between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump stand at a virtual tie, and that has many worried about the possibility of a contested election. 68% of Americans are concerned people will resort to violence if they are unhappy with the outcome. Contributing to those fears are recent findings that 19% of Republicans and 12% of Democrats say that if their candidate loses, he or she should declare the results invalid and do whatever it takes to assume office." End quote. So that's a pretty big number from Republicans for sure, 19%. And not a small number from Democrats either, 12%. Now, I believe the number for people that are discontent after the election is somewhere close to like 45% from both the Democrats and the Republicans. Whenever their candidate loses, they believe that some funny business went on in the election. It's an interesting statistic, no doubt about it. I always find that one funny after we watch the election, and I look at it and say, oh, okay, so this side lost. Let's see the discontent numbers and the possibility of cheating numbers that we throw out afterwards when people start polling. And it's always funny to see them flip. You know, it happened in 2016 with Hillary Clinton. It happened in 2020 with Donald Trump. So it's always interesting to see our skepticism come out when we don't get the result that we necessarily want. And I agree that we are at a point where it feels like we are much closer to something, but that is more than likely because, one, it's talked about a lot in the media. The idea is propagated, therefore it's in the front of people's mind. But two, because we're more divided. But just because we're more divided doesn't mean it has to break out into something violent. We can be more divided on the issues and really far apart on the issues and still understand that we need to live in a democratic society where those ideas have to be talked about, they have to be learned by everybody else who's coming into the electorate, and they have to be argued on a national scale. So don't get me wrong, I have a skeptical side to me, and I'm kind of playing devil's advocate here because I would say you should be more skeptical of anything that involves politics on a national scale, on a local scale, on a state scale, more than you're skeptical of other things in general, just the way that you interact with people. You don't need to be a generally skeptical person, but I would be more skeptical about elections. And I'm playing devil's advocate here because you still have to, in order for the voting system to work, you still have to have some faith in the voting system. And I do not want to propagate things that make people not have faith in the voting system, because I have faith that your vote matters to some degree, and I want to ensure that I am not part of the problem that actually causes people to lose faith in the system, and therefore when the result comes in that they do not like, they have even less faith in the system. It becomes kind of a negative feedback loop. It becomes a spiral downhill that is not to the benefit of many, many people. But hey, that's enough rambling from me on that stuff. Let's jump into our daily delight. This one, since we're coming up on Halloween, this is a article talking about a costume contest in the middle of NYC, and it is dogs who are absolutely adorable. There's a little feed from all the winners or people that were actually involved in the costume contest, and I think that you should go read this article. It's from timeout.com. It will be linked in the description below that like and subscribe button, as well as all the other articles from today that are down there. You can also find down there the link to the podcast on Spotify, Pocket Cast, Podvine, and you can find the Twitter handle at Your Daily Flip, where I post a Twitter tirade every Tuesday and Thursday. And if you want to keep up to date on international news and want to do it in a short amount of time, we have the 6 and 6 stories from around the world in 6 minutes or less that come out on Tuesday and Thursday as well. But that's over here on the YouTube channel and on the RSS feed. So with all that said, there's only one more thing to say. Stay safe. Don't die.